Our second speaker is Avens O'Brien. She's a second-generation libertarian activist, the product of unschooling, peaceful parenting, and started university at 14 years old. Her work within the libertarian movement includes being vice chair of the Libertarian Party of New Hampshire from 2006 to 2008, working for Peter Schiff's investment firm, and multiple presidential campaigns, including Ron Paul's 2008 campaign. She contributes to the Libertarian Republic, where her most viral article was 12 Reasons You Can't Get a Liberty Lady. She is a chapter leader of the Ladies of Liberty Alliance and is probably best known as a Facebook agitator who never blocks anybody, which is, that's really something to go on the resume, I think. And I'll have to apologise for my language up front. Her speech title is I'm Not a Fucking Leftist, but Here's Why Idiots Call Me One. Welcome, O'Brien. To the stage.
So anyway, I wanted to talk about the Nolan chart first because there's a whole lot of conversation about left libertarianism, right libertarianism, what they mean exactly, and why they're used sometimes as insults among libertarians. But David Nolan in 1969 developed this Nolan chart to try to change the understanding of the political compass as not a one-dimensional left-right spectrum, but rather this two-dimensional aspect where there's personal issues and there's economic issues, and at the top is libertarianism. And so if you believe in full freedom for personal issues, full freedom for economic issues, you're not a liberal or a conservative, you're just a libertarian. And so for the record, whenever I take this quiz, I end up at the very top of it. However, because I sometimes talk about things that leftists or liberals or Democrats or other people care about, people call me a leftist. They call me a leftist because I advocate just as strongly, besides economic issues, for things like sex, drugs, and rock and roll, for sex workers' rights, for feminism, for gay rights, and for all sorts of things that people go, oh, do we really want to talk about that? That might make us unpopular. And I'm willing to talk about those things. I care about those things. And so they're very degenerate things, but I think they make life more fun. So what I was going to say, my notes are really terribly written. So on that, I could talk about, there's a lot of subjects that I talk about. If you've ever seen, I don't know if any of you follow me on Facebook. If you've ever seen me on Facebook, I love to agitate and talk about a lot of different topics and get people on the left and the right to get very angry and argue. And so when I talk about leftist issues, I could talk about LGBT issues, but I think Andy's got that in the next presentation, so I'm gonna let Andy do that. I could talk about my support of immigration rights, my right to be able to rent to sell to, and to employ anyone regardless of their documentation coming into my own country. I could talk about drug rights and the fact that I believe that anyone has the right to put anything they want into their body or take anything out of it, whether that's marijuana, heroin, or a fetus. So what I'm going to talk about instead, because I have the angry feminist hair color and haircut, is I'm going to talk about feminism. And so I'm going to start with the fact that in I'm going to mention the fact that David Nolan, the inventor of this chart, went on to co-found the Libertarian Party in the US in 1971. And in 1972, we had two presidential candidates, John Hospers, who was openly gay, and Toni Nathan, who's a woman. And she's actually the only woman in the US before Hillary Clinton to have won an electoral vote in the 1972 election. Toni Nathan, after her run as vice president, went on to found the Association of Libertarian Feminists. And the reason she did this was because feminism was becoming a big issue in the US and in other parts of the world. But there were a lot of things that were important to her that feminists were bringing up about their own rights, about women's rights not being recognized in the US. And she wanted to make sure that there was a place for people who cared about those issues to go when they didn't want government to solve them, when they didn't want government to redistribute stuff, she didn't want government to be the arbiter of how these rights should come about. Simply the government should get the hell out of the way. So So the reason that this was really important to me is because my mother was involved in this fight. My mother is 40 years older than me. She started college in 1964, and she's also a libertarian activist. And in 1964, she didn't have legal access to birth control. She didn't have legal access to an abortion. And when she got a job in 1964 and wanted to put her money in a bank account, she wasn't allowed to unless her father or her husband co-signed on that bank account. It wasn't her money, it was theirs. And she could only access it with their permission. And so she found a bank that would allow her to do that. But the fact is, she had a big fight ahead of her. And so I grew up in an era where those problems didn't exist. My mother had to fight for those rights, but I didn't. But as a result of her, I've always been a member of the Association of Libertarian Feminists, and I've always cared about feminist issues, about seeing the fact that women at some time in history did not have the same legal rights, and they still in many places, still don't. And in the US, less so, but there are still reasons to care about feminism. In fact, yeah, actually, I was realizing in 1973 in the U.S. is when when Roe v. Wade was passed. And prior to that, there were only 4 states in which someone could get an abortion. Like the rest of the states in the U.S., which would be 46 of them, you could not access an abortion. So, obviously, the question I get most often in terms of why I care about feminism is, what the hell is left? Like, we've got a right to birth control, we've got a right to abortion. So what's the matter with feminism? Feminism might need to happen in Saudi Arabia or those other countries where they don't have women's rights, but what about in the U.S.? And it's a fair question to ask, because I think that when you look at third wave feminism, you certainly, they're a little crazy. Even the libertarian feminists are going to tell you that they're batshit. But feminism does actually have relevance today in the US and other Western countries. See, in the US, we still have to deal with abortion rights being threatened. Things like HB 2 in Texas last year, which was struck down by the Supreme Court, created extra regulations for abortion clinics that were completely unnecessary and created undue burden for women to access abortions. Birth control should be available over the counter, and it isn't presently. It's something that feminists have not done enough to actually fight for, and libertarian feminists are much more adamant about this subject, the fact that we should be able to access birth control without having to go to a doctor and say, hey, can you please give me my prescription? I don't know what the status of birth control pills here in Australia is, but in the US, you actually have to go to a doctor. There's 4 states in the US that allow you to get birth control without a prescription, and they're California, Oregon, and I can't remember the other 2, so never mind that list. But there are other laws that women are subject to in the states, particularly regarding pregnancy. Because as soon as you become pregnant in the US, you lose your right to things like actual care if you happen to be a drug user. If you happen to be a drug user and you can go to a clinic and get rehabilitation help, then that's great. But if you happen to have a fetus inside of you, suddenly you are imprisonable. And so that's a huge issue for me, the idea that we need to get people help, not put women in prison and then put their babies in the care of the state. In 2013, a woman in Florida wanted to have a natural birth, and the state of Florida her doctor first advised that she should have a C-section regardless of whether or not she wanted one. And then the state of Florida actually held that ruling, that she would have to have a C-section whether or not she consented. And this is the sort of thing that still exists in the United States, that she doesn't have the right to her own body to determine how she's going to actually have her baby. This isn't even about abortion. This is about her right to control how she has her baby. On top of that, there are certain issues that libertarian feminists are willing to talk about that mainstream feminists in the US don't. Something like rape culture in prison, which is something that I care deeply about. And I think you were going to talk a little bit about that, Andy, so that's good, because I don't have enough time to keep going on about that. But one of the issues that I tend to care about is dealing with not just rape culture in terms of people harassing women on the streets or things like that, but the fact that in prison, people are stuck in cages and susceptible to things like rape. And I do believe that feminism has a role to play in the social conversation, and I'm not talking about social justice warriors yelling about things that don't really matter, about like, oh well, like let's degender all toys or whatever. That's not the thing that I care about. But the fact is, my 5-year-old niece was told the other day that girls aren't allowed to like Star Wars from some other boy who's like 5 years old. And I think that feminism has an ability to just be a critical lens on looking at why do we make these assumptions, and how can we just combat them without making it a huge cause, but making it something that we just constantly look at with a critical eye and argue in public spaces about the proper role of gender. Lastly, since I have about 2 minutes left, is I want to leave you with this point, is that a lot of people, especially in the US, I have no idea what it's like here in Australia, so I'm sorry I can't speak intelligently about that. But in the US, in libertarian circles, there's a lot of people who refer to people who care about issues that Democrats might care about sex work, about feminism, about gay rights, that they refer to us as leftists simply because we want to talk about these things. And that doesn't make us leftists. At the end of the day, I'm a Murray Rothbard hardcore capitalist. And so, I worked for Peter Schiff. I'm an Austrian economist. I'm not a leftist by any stance unless you're on the right side of the spectrum and my middle happens to be your left. So that's what I want to leave you with. Not every person you call a leftist is actually a leftist. It's about, do they care about economic freedom and do they care about personal freedom?